yourself. Our next speaker, Matthew Stewart, has made a rash decision to move away from New Zealand across the ditch to Australia. Can't help but remind him of it on a regular basis, but we're hoping that bringing him to places like Queenstown will eventually draw him back to where he should be. So being Kiwi, Matthew actually grew up in Nigeria and Hong Kong, and then claimed New Zealand as his home. Completed a commerce degree, majoring in food marketing. So we know who to blame for all of that in advertising. But fortunately, he turned his attention to something a little bit less evil, a little bit more good, and is now specialising in human movement and osteopathy, and has nearly 20 years' experience in manual therapies. Please join me in welcoming Matt to the stage.
So I was never actually a practicing food marketer. I decided pretty early on. And I can say that for 2016 I'm moving back to New Zealand. So my talk is based around physical activity guidelines and movement. So the questions are physical activity guidelines, well, they are focused on cardiovascular health, but what about the rest of our body? We focus a lot on the cardio aspect. And are the current models and language and stories that we use to describe our bodies appropriate in understanding their function? And what can we learn from looking back to our ancestral pasts, because there are many of them, and from current science to improve on our musculoskeletal resilience? So what is resilience? We could say it's our ability to bounce back, our toughness. And I'll focus on the physical side, and maybe we could say that the mental side is no less important, but I'll let other speakers touch on that. But what I would say is it's difficult to have peace of mind if you don't have peace of body. So I started looking for stories of resilience, and there's one that most everyone knows from ancient Greece, and there's actually two versions. The first one you're probably quite familiar with. So it goes like this: Athens is under threat of attack from the Persian army, and the battle occurs in a place called Marathon. When the battle concludes, a runner is dispatched to run the 26 miles to Athens, where on arrival he proclaims, "Rejoice! We are victorious," and falls dead. There is, however, a little bit more of a historically accurate version. It's not that dramatic, so maybe that's why we haven't heard it so much. So it's 490 BC, and Athens and Sparta were part of the Persian Empire. They were sort of fledgling city-states, and the Persian king sent heralds requesting tokens of submission. So that's land and water to go back to the king to say, "You are my subjects." But Athens and Sparta were a little bit spicy, and they decided to slay the heralds. And King Darius didn't really appreciate this, so he threw himself into a bit of a rage and said, "Right, I'm going to teach those guys a bit of a hiding, and give them a bit of a hiding." And they landed, he assembled this huge army at the top at Marathon, 20,000 troops and 600 ships. When the news came through, the Athenians headed off to meet the Persians. And they sent a messenger, who you probably know as Vigorous. And he was one of the Athens army's core of runners. So he was nothing special. He was about my age. He was a bit over the hill. He was a master runner. And so he was sent to Sparta to request some reinforcements. So he ran over the mountainous terrain. This was August, so it was incredibly hot. And he did that faster than a horse could do in those conditions. And he covered that terrain, that 140 miles, and he arrived the next day. That's 225 kilometers. And when he got there, the Spartans were like, yes, we'd love to come and help you. That'd be great. We're all keen for a battle. You've seen our movies. That's good. But we're celebrating this festival, and we can't come until 6 days later, because if we go now, then we'll upset our gods. So Phidippides runs 140 miles, 225 kilometers back, and tells his compatriots that the Spartans not coming. So they do something very rash. They decide to just head straight into the Persians and attack them. This is the most feared army of the age, and they just went straight into them. It had never been done before. It's kind of like facing the All Blacks in semi-finals. And what they actually routed them and drove them back to the sea, and the Persians got back onto their ships and decided that maybe they could try by the sea and come around to Athens harbour. So the soldiers the next day hiked the 21 or 24 miles, because it depends which way you went, back to Athens in the brutal August heat, and that took them 6 or 7 hours. And that was in full body armour. So the first version is pretty accurate, except that he didn't run from Marathon to Athens after the battle. The distance wasn't 26 miles, it was 280, and he didn't drop dead after climbing the victory. Now, why am I telling the story? Why is it important? Well, the Persians, if they had won at Marathon, would have changed the course of history. And if you read some history, this is one of the battles that was used. And we would have turned our back in the Western world, at least, on democracy, rule of law, jurisprudence, art, sciences, mathematics, philosophy, and learning. So, not really a big deal. And if you want to do that race, maybe you would like to do this one, and stuff, you can, this is run every year. It's called the Spartathlon. And they run it in one direction. There is one guy who's done it in both directions. So he got to Sparta and he ran back the same back, and he did that in 54 hours. And he did it twice. He's
10K now.
quite a crazy freak. So one of the most pivotal battles in history is not remembered for resilience and strength and endurance of the 6,000 Athenian soldiers and their messenger, Phidippides, but its historic weakness and frailty. And these stories affect our perception of resilience, and they're ingrained in our culture. An ingrained belief that the human body is fragile. And we have been convinced by industry, and I was going to join that industry, that human bodies need all kinds of support. We need our bodies compressed. I don't know what we did for that compression stuff, but we can't trust our thirst, and we haven't got enough sports-themed gooey sugar products to prevent hitting the wall, and we need to know our sweat rate, our heart rate, our stride rate, what's on the bike, and the best protein comes powdered, and we need to drink it within 30 minutes of exercise, or else bad things might happen. So how did Phidippides develop resilience to be strong enough to run to Sparta and back? And can we have a fraction of that resilience too? How did these ancient Greeks train their athletes and soldiers to be resilient, not to need this kind of stuff? Well, first of all, we have to get over some of these images of frailty and stories of frailty, because we have stories that kind of play on this. And I don't know if you saw this earlier in the year, the story that went around. Fast running is deadly as sitting on the couch, scientists fine. Jogging too much will probably kill you. Training very hard is bad as no exercise at all. So all the major outlets. When you look back at the original study, you realise the conclusion was based on the fact that 2 joggers died over a period of 10 years. And that's where that headline comes from. So it's a valid question. the dose of exercise is that important if can we do too much. But it came down to 2 joggers, and we don't know what other guy is. They could have been electrocuted, but who knows. But it's a valid question. Is there a dose-response curve? And actually, for most of the other research, it says that the more that we do, the better off we are. So we make vigorous and moderate, so it keeps on going, we get benefits. And then one comparing walking and running, saying that a 5-minute run might have the same benefits as walking if you were strong enough to run. That's one of my things. But what if you looked at a population that performs a lot of vigorous exercise? Would you find an association here between doing too much vigorous exercise and dying? Well, you could look at these Tour de France riders. You could say this is maybe the second most vigorous, strenuous endurance activity next to the race across America. And they matched them to general population. What they found that these cyclists, a lot of them were actually born in the 19th century, so this is very early Tour de France, so maybe they were living a more ancestral lifestyle. But even when they're doing this very grueling sort of training, it doesn't seem to affect them. In fact, they live longer. And you can see but we're not all elite athletes, although we may wish that we were. So we could count ourselves safe because we're not really getting into this area. Unless we train in a way that might strain our hearts. Say, for instance, if we tried to copy the training style of elite athletes. But we don't. We actually probably train how we think they train. And when you look at recreational runners or recreational athletes, that's the top bar, they spend a lot of time in that moderate zone. Okay? And that's in contrast to elite athletes. They actually spend a lot of their time doing very easy activity. This is for most runners, this is the embarrassingly slow pace. For the people who go out and cycle, this is not with the pack trying to outdo each other. So in contrast to professional athletes, recreational runners do more moderate intensity workouts and less high intensity. So they're sort of stuck in the middle there. They're never really going high, moving fast occasionally, and not moving slowly lots. And this holds true for rowers, for speed skaters. This is the Dutch completely dominate the Olympics through this. The Kenyans dominate in running through using this approach. So maybe that's one we could use ourselves. So we've got a high intensity stuff, and if you know your zones, I don't really know that, but 4 and 5, that's when you're really going hard out. You can think of really nothing else. Your vision actually starts to get a little bit narrow because you're producing adrenaline. You're getting quite focused. You're not thinking about the shopping list when you're doing this type of thing. And then low intensity is long run pace or long slow cycling, that kind of thing. And that's where you want to spend most of your time. And this is backed up by modern research that perhaps this is how those ancient athletes actually did their training too. So this isn't actually catastrophic. This won't kill you if you put on your Top Gun soundtrack and you get into the, above that green zone into that moderate zone, and the eye of the tiger, and I'm feeling good. And you pick up the pace. It's all it's really going to do is prevent you from progressing at the rate that you perhaps could. And I'm a runner, so I think this is one of the things that runners, one of the mistakes they do, they run too hard. The other one is overstriding, and the other one is not doing strength. I'm not looking at you. And you may have heard of 80-20 versus polarized training. So the polarized is actually just taking out completely that moderate intensity and saying, I'm just going to do high intensity intervals, really, really fast stuff, and then I'm going to do the low intensity stuff. And this will really be tuned into where you are in your training, and your preference. Because some high-level athletes do really well with what's on the left, and others do really well with what's on the right. But they do get to those highs and those lows, and they don't mess with that in between. So the takeaway here is move slowly lots, which is, thank you very much, number 3 lanyard, and move fast once in a while, which is lanyard number 4. So that's my time my talk summarised there. So what were these ancient Greeks doing? They were chasing hares and horses, they were bending the backs of the bulls, they were wrestling lions, they were carrying their weights, they were pulling box cuts, and please don't do some of those at home there. But we don't need to recreate these. So this was interesting when I was digging around. Ancestors, talking about ancestors, they pay no attention to the condition of the athlete. They are training even though he is harmed by his food, his wine, the secret snacks he eats, mental strain and fatigue. How can we prepare such an athlete? So 1800 years ago, people were talking about this. So if the ancient Greeks were cross-training, how are we doing on our physical activity? Well, actually, probably not that great. About 50% in New Zealand hitting these physical activity guidelines. And what are they? Well, this is per week, so 150, I think we all know this one, push play, 30 minutes a day, that kind of thing. But I think it's that bottom one, maybe that message is not being communicated all that well. And when we have a look at what's happening, back, having a look at where people are getting their messages, and it's often from GPs, is that message getting across? And we've got some data for Australia, it's about 80% are getting that message. So 60% are getting some aerobic information, and then about 13% in resistance training, which, interestingly enough, is getting there, but when you look at they're not getting the specific information. So if you are a strength coach out there, then you should be helping out your GPs here. And one other thing is that GPs are not getting the support to promote this message, at least in Australia. If we put this aside for a second, the heart, put it aside for a moment, and then concentrate on our physical body, could we get to a place where we're more resilient? Because aerobic exercise is all great and it helps us, it's really a response to cardiovascular disease epidemic. But there's more to cardiovascular disease than the aerobic exercise will address. There's certainly an element of energy metabolism and inflammation. So you can't outrun a crappy diet. So what I'd like you to do is to get up and stand for a moment. And I want you to do 3 things. I want you to jump 3 times. Okay, that's great. It's kind of hard work. Now I want you to really launch into it. Just do 1 really full-on jump. And then I'd like you to balance, so you're leaving the ground a little bit, and get faster until you find a nice little sweet spot. Yep. Good. So, you can sit down if you like. So the first one, it was hard work. The second one, you actually all preloaded your system, your connective tissue system. So what you did on the third one is you found the sweet spot where you're jumping out of your connective tissue system. What was happening here is you were being very efficient biomechanically and keeping your muscle so it didn't contract. And your tendon was doing all the work. Okay, that was that sweet spot. So what we have here is a biotensegrity system. It's the combination of tension and integrity giving you that name. And when we apply it to biological systems, we get biotensegrity. And this explains biological systems better than classical mechanics. And we've been trying to explain it with classical mechanics, but it just doesn't work. If you want to know more about this, it's these two people here, Stephen Levin and Donald Ingber. This is sort of an exercise to get. So what Philip was talking about is fascia being very, very popular and fashionable, but it works together in the system, and it's the system, the synergy of components give rise to properties not seen when we consider them in isolation, which is what we just saw just now. If you want to train this system, you can, but aging will move it to the right-hand side, make it more disorganized. Training will move it back. The good thing here is that it will happen, but it takes some time. If you're training, this seems to have a response whereby we need three days to recover, and it's 1 to 2 times a week. I'll just move through a little bit. So what does this training look like? Well, it looks like a lot of things you've probably seen already, but with a consideration of this biotensegrity system, whereby we don't neglect either the fascia or the bone or the muscle. There's two challenges I see. There's an aging population and there is an environmental challenge. I really like this story of Gus, who she had 3 falls. She was unsteady on her feet and she had poor eyesight and she was using her walking frame. She got into some strength training and she just feels so much better. The following one is Charles Eugster. This is not the typical image of a 96-year-old man who took up sprinting a couple of years ago and is now the world champion and world record holder. At 87, he thought he was clapped out because he was doing endurance exercise. Found himself short of breath, so he did what everyone does. They engaged the services of Mr. Olympia and spent 7 years putting himself back together. So we are shaped by our environment, and as far as I'm concerned, we've got to kind of look at our cities, because we're not going back to some agrarian ideal. And what I do see is that our cities are growing bigger and more dense, but we don't have the green space in which to accommodate ourselves. So we really need to find a way to make the cities work for us. And in conclusion, move slowly lots. Move fast once in a while. Strengthen your selective tension modifiers. These select and create your tension. And train your fascia. Stimulate and feed your bones. And be activists for your activity. Others